afternoon. Welcome back to Salon Sundays with Carey, episode 4. Today we are going to be talking about dance pairs. But first let's just review a little bit, kind of what we've covered, but also to talk a little more about the relationship between Bach's solo works and Telemann's solo works. So Telemann wrote 12 fantasies, and we know that a fantasy was a little bit of had a connotation, that title of a connotation of a divergence, of an individualistic approach, something perhaps non-traditional. And I think Telemann used that title very intentionally. I think he diverged from typical dance forms and a typical form of a collection of dances in every suite, every fantasy that he wrote. But at any rate, there are 12, and they're divided into the front half of the book, 1 through 6, and the back half of the book, 7 through 12. Now you're hearing 7 through 12. But the front half is very interesting because they each include a fugue. And the back half are more, a little more traditional. However, Bach wrote also 12 works for solo stringed instruments. He wrote 6 suites for solo cello. He wrote 3 sonatas for solo violin and 3 partitas for solo violin. And we'll talk about a little more about the relationship between these works. But I just wanted to review and say that each of these forms of a dance suite, the dance suite typically include an allemande, courant, sarabande, and a gigue. But each of those forms, Telemann's fantasies, Bach's sonatas, Bach's partitas, and Bach's suites for solo cello, diverged in a different way. I chose this particular fantasy 11, for episode 4, because I wanted to highlight something that is really important to the Bach suites, and actually was an important divergence from a typical dance form at the time, and that is a pair of dances. We have perhaps a minuet, and then a second minuet, which is in a related key, and then we make a da capo. We go back to the beginning of Menuet 1. So it's Menuet 1, Menuet 2, da capo, Menuet 1. And this fantasy, Fantasy 11, begins with a da capo dance. Now, this is, I think, kind of an ingenious form for Telemann. The Un poco vivace, which is the first part of this first movement, is in 2/4. To me, it's not a recognizable dance. In fact, I'm not even sure what it is. It's kind of episodic. It goes from being jaunty to declamatory to virtuosic. It's in essence, I think it's a great collection of ideas, and it's a wonderful sequence. But he's pointing towards a form maybe we're going to see later in history. And then the second part, the B section of this da capo, is a very gentle, in fact it's called Soave, gentle, sweet. It's in 3/8, so it's not really a sarabande, but it is a kind of beautiful foil to the first part of this. And then at the end of this slower middle movement, he goes back to that 2/4 to Un poco vivace again. This fantasy really only has 2 movements, so it has this big Un poco vivace, Soave, Un poco vivace, and then it has one of those strange little throwaway dances. And in this case, it's a courant. And it's one of the strangest things that I've really ever played from this time period in terms of phrase structure. The first section, the A section, is only 6 measures long. Now, I guess I've seen 6 measure phrases. They would have been divided into 3 2-measure phraselets. But this is 6 measures, but it's divided into 4 little phraselets. So that each one is sort of 2.5 measures. So they're all, nothing is really square. And it's very strange. Again, I think that Telemann's use of this particular character of these short, non-traditional formed, non-traditional phrase structures, non-idiomatic final movements to these fantasies is one of the very interesting things. And we'll talk about that a little more. But for now, Fantasy 11. On poco vivace is B-flat major. The middle section is in C minor, sort of, and then it goes back to the B-flat major, and then the little courant is B-flat major. So, I'm about to try and explain something I think that is really quite difficult to get at. We have all these kinds of dance suites. We have things that were called overtures, we had things that were called sonatas, we had things that were called fantasies, we had things that were called suites. And more generally, in the Baroque period, almost everything came in the form of music for church or music for chamber. The Sonata de Chiesa, Sonata de Church Sonata, took on some characteristics. Sonata de Camera, chamber sonata, took on another set of characteristics. And all of these things are related. There's another term which is really important, and this is actually what you just heard, which is a galantarian, a gallantary, or a gallant dance. These, the actual translation of perhaps chivalrous or courteous, but the context is that these gallantry were exactly what Telemann was doing. They were outside of the dance form. They weren't an allemande or a courant or a sarabande or a gigue. They were in some way different, either different in form or a different dance. And there are many other dances. Gavottes, passe-pied, what's it? So sorry. I'm just drawing a blank, but there's 10 of them. And these other dances would appear, and they would be these little outside of the box. These dances which didn't fit, and composers used to put their individual stamp on things. So we have to talk about these in related ideas, and this is why it's so difficult to talk about. So, if there are 12 fantasies of Telemann, and I consider them to be dance suites, the first 6 are probably, he probably considered them as church sonatas, sonata de chiesa. They included fugues, and all 6 of them included a fugue. Now the interesting thing is that many of the other movements, and in fact the fugues themselves, had aspects of galanterie. They were divergent, right? Now, the second set, the set of Telemann fantasies that I'm playing for you, are almost entirely galanterie. The courants don't have pickups. There's these little strange little throwaways at the end. This courant that you heard, where did that come from? It came from his imagination, and he put them at the end of the suite as something different, as something gentle and courteous, chivalrous, something out of context, or in a different context, I think is a better way to put it. Now, Bach wrote his 6 suites for cello, and his 3 sonatas for solo violin, and his 3 partitas for solo violin between about 1717 and 1723. Telemann published his fantasies in 1735. They were not very far apart geographically, and we do not know whether Telemann was aware of Bach's work for solo stringed instruments. We do not know whether he heard them. And frankly, I feel like he must have. Because I feel like his fantasies are a little bit responsive to what Bach did with his genius work. To start with the suites for cello, which you've already heard, these are sonata de camera. They are chamber sonatas. And they are a very traditional form, with the exception that he started each suite with a prelude, a kind of fantasy of its own, an improvisatory movement. And then Allemande, courant, sarabande, and then he inserted galanterie. He inserted dance pairs. In the first two suites, he inserted Menuet I and II. In the third and fourth suites, he inserted Bourrees I and II. In the fifth and sixth suites, he inserted Gavottes I and II. And these are all on the list of gallant dances. So these are chamber sonatas. Now, when Bach came to writing his 3 sonatas and 3 partitas for solo violin, his 3 sonatas are sonata di chiesa. They are church sonatas. They include these magnificent 4-voice fugues, which are just incredibly difficult to play. And while Telemann certainly showed off how the violin can accompany itself, being its own bass, and represented multiple voices, Bach went way beyond that in terms of the technique required for the violinist, and also for the form, the length. So they are, the sonatas are, shall we say, divergent in that his fugues were so challenging for the violin, one. They really were all contrapuntal work. In other words, the violin was always accompanying itself. That was something quite remarkable. But then he wrote his partitas, and the partitas are sonata da camera. They're more chamber sonatas. And they include more traditional dance movements. But Bach inserts galanterie. He has an allemande, and then there's a double. So we have a D major, a D minor allemande, and then he basically will change not the key, but the harmonic rhythm. Make it faster notes, for example, or accelerate the whole phrase structure. So they are related, and the double is a galanterie. So, you know, it's in a way a trifle. Now, of note is the second partita, quite traditional, allemande, courant, sarabande, G, I believe, and then a chaconne, and which is like 30 minutes long. It's over a ground bass, and it's incredible. It's an incredible work. Some people think that Bach sort of intended it to be separate from the dance suite itself. I really don't. I think he thought, wow, this is a great little partita. Now look what's going to happen. I think he was very serious about having it be something different. Again, very individualistic how they approached these things. And I think that after 100 years of people writing boring old dance suites and following the rules, where the allemande is in 4/4 with a pickup, and the courant is in 3/4 with a pickup, and there may be 2 different kinds of them, but there's only 2 different kinds of them, I think that these guys were really getting outside the box and starting to, within a very clear traditional Baroque framework, starting to really explore what could be done with the instruments and what could be done with form. So at any rate, it's fascinating. And I hope that I've explained it well in simple enough terms. It's I think, quite complex, and every single dance has different forms and regional styles. The sarabands, there's at least 2 kinds of sarabands, and there's at least, really, you know, there's Italian and French and Spanish, and there's all of these different regional and individual influences. But generally, what we have is, in the Baroque, 150 years of dance suites. Now, one more note about the Bach suites, and Bach's creation of them, including these dance pairs. His suites for solo cello were basically unknown except to teachers of the cello, who often use them, consider them as etudes, who really perhaps considered that they were written as etudes. Like Bach wrote some of his Well-Tempered Clavier as study pieces for students. But in 1889, a great cellist named Pablo Casals, 13 years old at the time, was in a thrift store, and he found an edition of the 6 Bach suites, an edition published by Grützmacher, a great cellist, and he bought them, and he started playing them, and he began performing them. And he is responsible for bringing them into the mainstream of the literature, for bringing them into the cellist's canon. He did not record them until 1936, until he was 60 years old. He found them when he was 13, he began playing them. He played them every day. They were his musical Bible. And I think that we really have him to thank for bringing them to light. So I'm going to play 3 dance pairs for you. The first, I'll start for the second suite in D minor, the Menuet I and Menuet II. Interesting, the suite is in D minor. The first minuet is in D minor. The second minuet's in D major. And often we have the opposite. Next, a bourrée from the third suite, Bourrees I and II. These are a little more traditional. C major, Bourrée I, C minor, Bourrée II. So finally, from the Fifth Suite, the Gavotte number 1 and number 2. And you know, this is really quite different, quite a different dance. The difference between a bourrée and a gavotte, they're both in basically in 4/4, but a bourrée has a quarter note pickup, and a gavotte has 2 quarter note pickups, or a half measure instead of a quarter measure, and you know, quite related, both galanterie. This Fifth Suite set of gavottes these Fifth Suites are both in C minor, just different treatments. It's kind of a different mode, and such different textures. And I guess that's where the interesting thing about the Telemann da capo dances that you heard, you know, 2/4 on poco vivace, and then this melancholy, supposed to be sweet, but really, because it's in C minor, quite something dark. That composers use the key relationship, and they use the different textures to create very different moods. And again, I would point you back to Bach's partitas with the doubles, where he used just sort of one aspect to make something, a kind of a variation that was really something different. And I think that's what we have here with these gavottes. So, in closing, Gavottes 1 and 2 from the C minor suite, the Fifth Suite of Bach. Well, thank you all very much. We have 2 episodes left. Back to 7 p.m. next week, and I'll be playing an E minor, the ninth fantasy, and it's really bright, and it's quite interesting to talk about in the way it diverges, and it has a terrific jig, and so then we'll have a lot of fun jigs to explore next week. And we'll see you then. Thank you very much.